And there, Ronald Reagan was up on the podium taking the oath of office. And it was about 3 minutes later that the hostages were actually in planes. They were on the tarmac, but they did not take off until Reagan took the oath of office.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. I welcome my colleague of many decades, Craig Unger. His new book, Den of Spies, Reagan, Carter, and the Secret History of the Treason that Stole the White House. This is October Surprise, put together, finally, after decades. Craig, congratulations. Good evening. And we go immediately to the tragedy, inside the tragedy. It is April 24th, 1980, at a spot in the Iranian desert called Desert One. There are Americans on the ground, including a rescue team. And the mission is vouchsafed by the President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, and his administration, waiting in the White House for word of the rescue efforts these men will carry out. Who are they aiming to rescue, and what happens that day? Good evening to you, Craig.
They're trying to rescue 52 American hostages that are being held by Iranian militants. The time is 1980, and it's just after the Iranian Revolution. Iran had been a strong U.S. ally, really a puppet of the United States. It was really important for geostrategic reasons, that as a power in the Middle East and as a great source of oil. But suddenly, a revolution turned that upside down, and the new Islamic Republic of Iran had taken over, and militants had seized American hostages. This became the central issue of the 1980 presidential campaign. Could President Jimmy Carter rescue the hostages or not? If he did, he would probably win re-election against Ronald Reagan. If he failed, Reagan would win.
The details we have today, I remember the news coming in very early that morning from the White House of failure. The 8 RH-53D Sea Stallion helicopters were designed for the mission. They were to be met at Desert One by C-130s carrying extra fuel. They were then, a rescue team was to go on with trucks to the embassy, overpower the students who were guarding the 52 American hostages, and return to Desert One for escape. However, on the way in, 2 helicopters fell by the wayside, giving them only 6, the minimum they needed to get everybody out. At Desert One, as they restarted for the rest of their mission, one of the helicopters, the hydraulic system, failed. Following that, we have instance of another helicopter taking off, collided with the C-130, an enormous fireball, and 8 Americans dead. The mission is canceled. The news strikes the White House. You give it a very dramatic moment as appalling. And at the same time, they're all thinking about the election. What was the immediate reaction back in Washington when they heard about the failure?
Well, Hamilton Jordan, who was President Carter's chief of staff, ran to the bathroom and threw up. Zbigniew Brzezinski, the national security advisor, says this was the worst day in history for President Carter. He looked as if he had been stabbed in the face. This was, for all practical purposes, a lot of people thought it was the end of the presidential election campaign. It made it virtually impossible for Carter to recover. How could he possibly negotiate with Iran when he had sent a military force into Iranian airspace? So suddenly all the negotiations were over. They're not made much headway anyway, but now Carter was stuck with virtually no options at all.
And it is April of an election year. It's necessary to put this all into motion with relationships. Jimmy Carter is the president of the United States, elected after the tragedy and the scandal of Watergate. He has emphasized civil rights and human rights in his administration. At the same time, he's been dealing with what he inherited. And one of the leaders of the world he inherited was Shah Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran, who in January of 1979, the previous year, said he was going on vacation. What was actually happening, Craig?
Well, he was actually had been overthrown, really. He had been pushed out by the Iranian Revolution, and he was very, very ill. He had lymphoma, and he was going from one place to another. Henry Kissinger said he was like I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the phrase, like a Dutchman looking for a port of call. But no one would take him. Carter very much did not want him to come to the United States. It was very clear to American intelligence that if we admitted the Shah to American soil, Iran would explode in a certain way. And that's partly because the Shah was installed by an American coup d'etat in 1953, and he became very much a puppet who was giving us terrific deals on oil, and he was a very important strategic partner in the Middle East militarily.
And the Shah came to America eventually in the fall of 79, and that was a trigger for the takeover of the embassy, I believe. These were students who took it over November 4th, 1979. To your information, was this a direction of the government of Iran, what existed at the time?
It was not at the direction of the government. It was at just students did it spontaneously. The title of my book is Den of Spies, and it's a reference to the American embassy because in 1953, when the Shah was installed, it was all planned out of that um, uh, out of the American embassy complex. And I went there. I went to Iran in, I believe it was 2014. And if you go there now, it is a spy museum, essentially, dedicated to show the perfidy of American espionage, and that this is where they put together plans to overthrow the government of Iran, and they succeeded in 1953. So the militants in Iran took it back. It was a certain with a certain amount of satisfaction.
So what we have here is Jimmy Carter inherited a problem he could not solve, and it got worse. However, there are more things to explore. For example, Jimmy Carter has been president for 4 years. He's running for re-election. In 1979, it's presumed that he's going to carry on. The country has been going through a very bad patch of inflation, the oil embargo. All of these things are happening at the same time. However, one relationship is more revelatory than any other. Two allies, ostensibly, President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, and Menachem Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel. What is their relationship at the time of Desert One, 79, 80?
They hate each other. This is just after the Camp David Accords of 1978. And this was, of course, the agreement by which Israel gave back to Egypt the Sinai. It won both Begin and Anwar Sadat of Egypt the Nobel Prize. It's an agreement that has lasted, what, I think it's 46 years now, and it's still holding firm. But it created a lot of animosity between Israel and the United States. Carter had really, who's generally considered a weak president, but he was very strong in forcing Israel to agree to the Camp David Accords. And it went through and it won the Nobel Prize, and it's been a lasting peace treaty. But Begin did not accept it easily. He hated Carter for it.
One more detail. Menachem Begin, head of the Israeli government, and the Shah Pahlavi, head of the Iranian government until the fall, and now a new government, which has promise of becoming a republic, at least promise. What was Israel's opinion of Iran and vice versa at this moment?
Well, it was very, very mixed. I mean, on the surface, everyone hated Iran. The Iranians were out in the streets chanting "Death to America." They called America the Great Satan. Israel was the Little Satan. Israel has had violent rhetoric about Iran. from the beginning of that revolution right up till today. It's still going on, and there's still the threat of war with Iran. But there was another level that very, very few people saw, and that is that Iran was about to be attacked by Iraq. Saddam Hussein was the dictator of Iraq. And if Iraq beat Iran, if they took over the oil fields in Iran, then they would be an enormous superpower. And no one wanted that to happen, least of all Israel. And also the United States didn't want it to happen either.
And the Ayatollah returning from Paris, his exile in Paris, what was his opinion of joining the community of nations at this point in April of 1980?
Well, he wanted an Islamic Republic. I mean, I interviewed the former president of Iran, Bani Sadr, who flew back to Iran with Ayatollah Khomeini. And initially, President Bani Sadr thought they were going to have a secular democratic government, but that changed dramatically once Ayatollah Khomeini got there, and moderates like Bani Sadr were marginalized and put off to the side, even though he'd become president. And a much more militant Islamic fundamentalist republic, which is not at all democratic, took place, and it exists just as it does today, 44 years later.
I'm speaking with the author, Craig Unger. His new book, Den of Spies, Reagan, Carter, and the Secret History of the Treason That Stole the White House. This is the October surprise legend. And when facts replace the legend, you print the legend is the Hollywood recommendation. We're doing the other way around. When facts replace the legend, you print the facts. And that's where we're going. You can't solve everything immediately, but we need to go to the Reagan election campaign, watching these events, the takeover of the embassy, the Ayatollah's rise, the death of the Shah, and now Desert One. Ronald Reagan is running strongly for president, but he fires his campaign manager, a man named John Sears, and hires Bill Casey. Who is Bill Casey that Ronald Reagan reached for him at this point in his campaign?
Casey's a very interesting choice as a campaign manager because he's not doing the things that normal campaign managers do. Normally, it's about raising money, and Casey did some of that. But Casey was also, to me, one of the great American spies, and I characterize him as a sort of a mix between James Bond and Mr. Magoo. And he mumbled a lot. That was his nickname, Mumbles. The joke was, after he became head of the CIA, was that all the senior officials needed scramblers on their phone, but not Bill Casey, because no one could understand what he said anyway. He sort of spat when he talked. He was going in a million directions at once, but he was dazzlingly brilliant as a spy. He had done enormously important work in World War II in the OSS, as you said, against the Nazis. But as he prepared, as the campaign started, Casey was also building up a secret intelligence network. When I went to Israel, I interviewed Yehoshua Saki, who was head of director of military intelligence for Israel back then. And he told me he had been meeting with Casey in 79 and 1980. This is just as the Iranian Revolution is taking place. They must have been talking about Iran. Casey was also meeting with South African arms dealers, with Israeli agents. He had a secret network all over the world, and he began to put it in action. And in November of 1979, he held a big fundraising party in New York for then candidate Reagan. Reagan, of course, was from California. He was not that plugged in on the East Coast. He needed Wall Street connections, and Casey had those Wall Street connections. And it was in the end of February or early March of 1980 that Casey took over the Reagan campaign.
Immediately, it is common knowledge that there is the possibility, after the Desert One rescue, that the Iranians will not release the hostages before the election. There is also the assumption that the president might do something like transfer an enormous amount of arms or money to Iran in order to induce them to release the hostages, because not everybody agrees that holding the hostages is a good idea for the future. One of them being Bani Sadr, the president of Iran, who Craig talks to in the course of his investigations. This is not a secret opinion. It's widespread that if the hostages are released, it will boost Mr. Carter. And though we look backwards with 2020 hindsight, the election was extremely close to the point of favoring the incumbent, as it always does, in the spring and summer of 1980. Have I said that correctly, Craig?
Yes, absolutely.
And because of that, Bill Casey recognized that the hostages could become a major component for Ronald Reagan's defeat. What is he going to do about it? And therein is the mystery. And we're going to turn to that mystery in just a moment, but I'm checking on one other relationship before we move on. Casey and Reagan, were they intimates? Were they friendly with each other? Because you note with great entertainment that Nancy Reagan was horrified with Casey's table manners. Had they known him very long?
Not really. Reagan's most famous quote about Casey is he said, you know what? I can't understand a word Bill Casey says. And you can ask him to repeat himself once, you can ask him twice, but you can't ask him a third time. That's rude. So generally, I just nod and smile. And you get the image that Casey is describing some very dangerous covert operation, and Reagan is just smiling and nodding his head. And so there are questions as to exactly how much Reagan knew. I tend to think he knew in broad strokes, but he didn't really know the details about what Casey was doing.
The book is Den of Spies, Reagan, Carter, and the Secret History of the Treason That Stole the White House. The events of 79 and 80 are now part of American history. Ronald Reagan is elected, and Jimmy Carter is castigated as a weak president. Iran is in a revolutionary state, pretty much the state you see today, although not as rich then as it is now. And at the same time, there are stories circulating that something untoward happened in the summer and fall 1980 that made it possible for the Reagan inauguration to celebrate the release of the hostages on that day. Strangely, we're at the kitchen table of Craig Unger on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and Craig is reading an op-ed, I believe, in the New York Times by Gary Sick. Who is Gary Sick, Craig?
Gary Sick was on Jimmy Carter's National Security Council. He was the point man on Iran during the hostage crisis. He had a background in naval intelligence. He'd been at Columbia University for the last 30 years or so. And he is very much a man who believes in empirical reality. He's a just the facts man. He takes facts and he analyzes them, and he's considered very sober-minded. For him to write this op-ed piece in the New York Times suggesting that the October surprise took place suddenly gave credibility to something that had just been whispered about.
There are other correspondents necessary. Craig is an investigative reporter and a book writer, and he has colleagues. And for those of you who plan to be investigative reporters, you have friends everywhere. You talk to each other. You move from job to job. You have proteges. You have mentors. It's a world within worlds. And we need to mention some of these names because they all contribute to this storytelling over decades. Who was Bob Parry at the time, reporting on the same story?
Bob Parry was a colleague of mine. He died a few years ago. He was an AP reporter, and he won the George Polk Award for uncovering the Iran-Contra scandal and being the leading reporter on that. He also had preceded me at Newsweek, and in theory, we were rivals because we were working on the same story. But as time went on, we began to work together and share information. And that happened with several other investigative reporters I was friendly with.
Yeah, Martin Killian, Seymour Hersh, all of these names are important to understand. We're building a story that is in the shadows. We now come to Craig presenting his thinking about this story to Esquire magazine, Esquire was embraced the story. This is the Hearst Corporation. What is it that they wanted you to do, Craig? What was the assignment exactly?
Well, essentially, I looked at read that op-ed piece. It's still memorable to me over 30 years later. And I really op-ed pieces are generally opinion pieces, but as I said, Gary was an intelligence analyst, and his opinions were rooted in real facts. So I thought if I could get to the basis of that, I could create a real dramatic narrative, which is what I did for Esquire, 10,000 word piece that would lead the way to uncovering all the key facts about this. It's also worth going back in time a little. I was someone who became an investigative reporter when the big stories of the day were Watergate, the Pentagon Papers, the My Lai massacre. And at the time, one investigative story like that could seize the national take control of the national conversation. It could lead to actual changes. And I thought we were still in that world. And I started pursuing the story along those lines, that I was going to get to the bottom of that. This was going to be, to me, what Watergate was to Woodward and Bernstein, but things didn't come out exactly that way.
Immediately, Greg turns to a source whose name has emerged from the allegation, the story, the legend, the fairy tale of October Surprise. That something untoward happened by the Republicans to keep the Iranians not in really non-transparently right up to the inauguration of holding those hostages. And then they were released. Something happened. And there's a man named Ari Ben-Menashe. Who is he? Who do you believe he is at the time you start talking to?
Well, he was one of several intelligence operatives who came out of the woodwork. They were all these super sources. And Ari was someone who was demonized as a nut, as a fraud and a hoaxer. And I wasn't sure. This was very difficult to investigate, because to investigate it, you had to go into the world of illegal arms dealing. And these are people who are extremely disreputable. There are rogue intelligence operatives, which is essentially, that's what Ari Ben-Menashe was. He was a rogue intelligence operative from Israel who was quite angry at Israel. They had let him stay in, he had been busted for arms dealing in New York. He spent nearly a year in the Metropolitan Correctional Center where Jeffrey Epstein died. He didn't like it there. Israel had sort of cut him loose. And to talk to these people, you put your career at risk, because you knew you would be discredited as a conspiracy nut. But I also knew there was no other way to get into the world of arms dealing than talking to actual arms dealers. So I began to talk to Ari Ben-Menashe, first by phone in Australia, and later when he came to the United States.
He tells two whoppers that immediately will jump off the page. The first is about Bill Casey in Madrid. What does he say?
Well, he's saying that Bill Casey was there, and that Bill Casey was there meeting with Iranians, and that was the place where the parameters of the deal were sketched out, the terms of the deals were sketched out, and at the end of meeting, I mean, what is so heinous about this? There are two things. One is that the Republicans are not even in power. So Bill Casey has no authority whatsoever to sell arms to Iran. In addition, there is an arms embargo against Iran, and it appears that he's violating the Logan Act, which prohibits private citizens from interfering with American foreign policy. And that's bad enough, getting the weapons to Iran, sending arms to people who are holding imprisoning Americans is one thing. But in addition, in return for those arms, Casey was asking for one other favor. And he was saying, don't release the hostages. Hold them until after the elections. He did not want the Americans released immediately.
This is the story Ben-Menashe tells. The meeting takes place, according to Ben-Menashe, in late July 1980 in Madrid. Now, the other whopper he tells, which is challenging, is that George Bush, previously the head of the CIA for Mr. Nixon, and among other jobs that he served, he ran for the Senate in Texas, George H.W. Bush, the father, and was not successful. At the same time, he's now the vice presidential nominee for Ronald Reagan, having challenged him heartily in the campaign process. Ronald Reagan chooses him as vice president. And the other Ben-Menashe story is that Ronald Reagan was in Paris in October of 1980, I believe. For what purpose? Ben-Menashe says.
This was to seal the deal, the final deal. It's around October 24th, which remember, that's like 2 weeks before the presidential election. And that's when the arms really start to flow to Iran.
Craig has this story, and he follows through with a lot of other interviews. We're going fast now because publication is competitive. The story is published in the October Esquire, which comes out, I guess, in what, early September? I can't remember how.
Yeah, yes, that's absolutely right. You got it.
Early September. These are the days before the internet, before the iPhone, before instant communication or Zoom or that. You do things on strange things called telephone booths. There used to be lots of them. You have home phones that don't even have answering machines, or they don't even have credible voicemail. We might as well have Pony Express notes on sagebrush blowing across the plains as we communicate. But Craig is pounding the pavement. He gets a story out. He's very proud of it. And immediately afterwards, well, soon enough, Newsweek gives him a call. I believe Jonathan Alter was at Newsweek at the time and said, the boss wanted to talk to you. What did they want, Craig?
They wanted to hire me to lead the investigation, and I was thrilled. I mean, it's also going back in time. I don't know if people can understand this, but a few organs in the media can dictate the national conversation. And Time and Newsweek were very, very powerful. Newsweek had its own 55-story building on Madison Avenue. It was a huge enterprise with dozens of international bureaus all over the world, foreign correspondents all over the world. And the three major networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, the New York Times, Washington Post, and these news weeklies, that was the flow of information to Americans. And suddenly I was at one of those very powerful institutions that could dictate the national conversation.
Craig Unger, Den of Spies, Reagan, Carter, and the Secret History of the Treason That Stole the White House. Craig and I were at the same gym on the Upper West Side at this time, and I was often listening to his tales about going from the success of Esquire to the resources available from Newsweek, with bureaus all over the world. With, as Craig says, when they want you to go somewhere, you just buy the ticket and go there. This is owned by the Washington Post, makes a great deal of money. There are editorial meetings. There's a team put together. It's extremely impressive. Maynard Parker is the editor-in-chief. He hires Craig in a conversation. John Barry is the head of the investigation, an Englishman. And they come together and have meetings, and Craig then goes to meet Ben-Menashe again, who flies in from Australia. All is going extremely well. Did you have any sense that it was not going in the direction you thought, Craig?
Not initially. I thought we were all on the same page, and wow, this was the team that was going to put it all together, and we would be the new sort of Woodward and Bernstein. That's the way it appeared to be going. And suddenly, about a month or so into it, or 5 or 6 weeks into it, everything turned upside down. And it became clear to me they were trying to discredit all the sources like Ben-Menashe. And what actually turned up with Newsweek, it was sort of astonishing to me, is they ended up doing 3 stories in a row saying the October surprise didn't happen, it didn't happen, it didn't happen. And if you know anything about news is when something happens. If something doesn't happen, There's no story. And there was just something very, very weird about it, and very upsetting to me. To me, this is one of the great disgraces in the history of American journalism.
This is 1991. That's important. There's a presidential race coming up in less than a year. George H.W. Bush, the man who Ben-Menashe claims flew to Paris as part of the deal making with Iran. George H.W. Bush is running for re-election against, a wide field of Democrats, all some hopeful, one young governor from Arkansas, as I recall. However, the Congress is in firm hands of the Democratic Party, Senate and House. And soon afterwards, there's an investigation forming. The important part of this is that the House investigation is led by Lee Hamilton. What does Lee Hamilton make of the Newsweek claim, assertion, articles that it didn't happen?
Well, to me, the House investigation was one of the great disappointments. It was a complete whitewash, and they really didn't pursue any. They just took. They didn't exactly take Newsweek at its word, but they came up with another alibi. One of the things that became apparent as we did this investigation is first there was an alibi that Bill Casey was in London, and Newsweek bought that he'd been at a convention and a reunion for veterans of the OSS. And he had been there briefly, but not the entire time. It turned out he had escaped for some of that. So the House of Representatives came up with yet another alibi, and Bob Parry punctured that alibi, but not enough for whatever it was. It seemed to me Lee Hamilton was one of these go along to get along guys. He didn't want to stir things up with the Republicans. At the time, the Democrats had a huge majority in Congress. I believe they had a 100-seat majority in the House of Representatives, but they were lapdogs and they should have been pit bulls.
There's a presidential election underway. And the committee's report is filed, I believe, in January of 92. January of 92, yes, correct me if I get these dates wrong. And at that point, they believe there's no more need for investigation. In 1994, and Craig has now published an article in Esquire that makes him a target. In Newsweek, he's been part of a team that investigated and said there's nothing to it. Craig asked his name not to be included in the Newsweek posting. Important here to note, you have friends. It doesn't seem that our protagonist at this time has any friends anywhere. The whole world is coming for him. However, Seymour Hersh calls you up. Who is Seymour Hersh and what does he tell you?
Well, Seymour Hersh is one of the great investigative reporters in American history. He did the My Lai massacre. He also did which really helped bring about the end of the Vietnam War. I mean, he broke. It was one of those stories that captured the American imagination and showed that American soldiers were capable of atrocities, and what we were doing in Vietnam really wasn't bringing democracy to Vietnam. He also had done a big story called The Family Jewels, in which he revealed so many of the CIA's great secrets. And in the middle of this, he calls me up and he's following what's going on. And we've been exchanging a few phone calls. And he says, you better drop it, Unger. You'll be crushed if you continue. And that's pretty much what happened to me. I was let go from Newsweek. I was sued by Bud McFarlane, who was Reagan's national security advisor, and papers, magazines like the New Republic, where I've been a contributor on and off for many years, started attacking the whole story, and I'm characterized essentially as a conspiracy nut.
And that when Craig gets that advice from Seymour Hersh, I remember him telling me about it. I didn't know what to make of it. Hersh was telling the truth. You will be crushed if you mess with powers such as the agency, the CIA, such as national security advisors for presidents, such as secretaries of state. You will be crushed. In the meantime, Mr. Unger doesn't listen and finds a way forward because magically, Bob Parry is on the trail as well, who has also been elbowed aside because he is publishing details. They don't have all the points together. They can't put it all together yet. The scale of this is very difficult to imagine, and you need sources with evidence. Bob Parry finds evidence. Now, as I remember, the parking garage is a big scene in Watergate. So Craig's got a parking garage. Here it is. There's a parking garage in the House of Representatives office building. And in that parking garage, there's a dusty door. You go through the door, there's offices that have been abandoned. And then there's what used to be a women's room. Inside the women's room, he finds what, Craig?
He finds some cardboard boxes and they've got papers in them. And I think even Bob didn't realize what he had stumbled upon initially. This is, as you say, an abandoned ladies' room, and under the tampon dispenser
30 seconds, Craig.
is loads and loads of documents, and there I have them, and they're 23 gigabytes worth of documents, and in them are the great secrets we've all been looking for.
When we come back, the story of October surprise, Den of Spies, Reagan, Carter, and the secret history of the treason that stole the White House. Craig Unger is the author. Bob Parry finds a treasure trove and immediately begins to answer questions about there's Bill Casey, and over here is the allegation. In between is a network. And we'll touch on some of this network because it begins to explain how this was put together. Casey's a genius. The right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing is a simple version of him. At the same time, he's described by people who saw him in action as frantic, always behind. I think of him as Alice's rabbit. He's always running to something else and doesn't disclose anything. He has allies and friends, people who admire him. Importantly is John Shaheen. Importantly is a safari club. Importantly is that all of these men and their colleagues have connections to arms dealers, to money laundering, to international intrigue, to men who change their biographies and present themselves as one thing when in fact they're frauds and something else. There are no hard answers here, but there is Bill Casey managing this. Greg, John Shaheen's important. The Hashemis are important. We'll touch on them. A man named Sensi's important. What is the Safari Club?
The Safari Club is a group of intelligence, high-level intelligence officials. And in the mid-'70s, there was a huge crackdown on the CIA. There was the Church Committee and the Pi Committee, which investigated CIA abuses and found that there had been coup d'etats by the CIA in Syria. I believe in 1949, in Iran famously in 1953, in Guatemala in 54, later in the Dominican Republic and Vietnam and so forth. Huge number of illegal operations, and there was a big crackdown. Once that happened, many people were forced out of the CIA as a result, especially after Jimmy Carter came in. And the Safari Club sort of came up. It was started in part by Alexandre de Marange, the head of French intelligence and a close ally of Casey. And it brought together people from Saudi intelligence, from all over the world to do international operations that were off the books. So suddenly, the kind of operations the CIA had done before Jimmy Carter were now being done off the books. And that's part of what the Safari Club did.
And that begins to describe what October Surprise is, off the books. We mentioned
Absolutely.
That Dick Allen, Richard Allen, was an advisor to Ronald Reagan's campaign with a list of distinguished names, all of whom served in the Reagan administration advising. It was Dick Allen who came up with the name October Surprise Group. It was partly a joke. It was wry. Carter's going to have to surprise us in some fashion. But it became the legend of October Surprise. Bill Casey didn't invent it, but he is responsible for it. Who are the Hashemis?
The Hashemi they were Iranian brothers who were arms dealers essentially, and they had connections with Iran, and they approached Jimmy Carter as soon as the hostages were taken and said, look, we still have good relations in Iran with the new regime. We can help win the release of the hostages. What Jimmy Carter did not know, and this is one of the things I discovered, was that they had known Bill Casey since the mid 70s. So they were essentially double agents who were really working for Casey, and the Carter administration did not realize that.
They were a source of information for Bill Casey, and Casey discovered them. Casey knew them beforehand. Do we have that, Craig?
Yes, we absolutely have that. In fact, there'd been an oil refinery in Newfoundland called the Come By Chance Oil Refinery, and it was it was owned by John Shaheen, who was Casey's best friend. He was an oil millionaire in New York. It was an odd place to have an oil refinery, and it never really worked as a business. But it appears to have been a front for a lot of the money that went into this operation. And the Hashemi's banks were used to finance that oil refinery. And Bill Casey was consulted as a lawyer, and I found documents to that effect in the mid 70s.
John Shaheen is I'm glad you mentioned him. Not only a bankroller, but a man who brings people together and was extremely loyal to Bill Casey. Is that correct, Craig?
Oh, absolutely. They attended reunions of the OSS every time they could. They were very, very close. Shaheen was a fairly low profile figure, and in most of the reporting on this, he barely surfaced at all. And to me, he became enormously important because he was Bill Casey's cutout. In espionage, if you're doing a covert operation, you can't be seen meeting with all the principals all the time. And Bill Casey, remember, he was in the limelight. He was in the media spotlight 24/7. He's running a presidential campaign. And he can't be seen meeting with Iranian arms dealers. So it was John Shaheen who was doing that. And one of the great breakthroughs in this came because the FBI was investigating the Hashemis for illegal arms dealing, and they were wiretapping them. And it took many, many years for me to get those wiretaps. But what would happen is you would hear them talking to John Shaheen, and then they'd go out and do an arms deal. And I have to presume, since Shaheen was so close to Casey, that this is how things were going on. Casey would talk to Shaheen, who would talk to the Hashemis, and then the arms deals would take place.
We're going very fast. This takes years. Parry discovers those files in 94. It isn't until he gets to the Bush Library in 2011 that he begins to, and then again in June of 2013, he left us in 2018, that we have these details that Craig is giving. The wiretaps are amazing. Like if they didn't exist, you'd say it was fiction, but there they are. Now, another connection that I think is important here is to understand is Israel. In 92, for the Village Voice, I believe, you traveled to Israel and met the man Hevroni, who was supervising Ben-Menashe, and you also met the man Sagi, who was supervising Hevroni. This is not Mossad, it's not Shin Bet, it's something called Aman. What is that?
That's Israeli military intelligence, and it's very important when it comes to arms dealing. And essentially, even though Ben-Menashe was in many ways a very unreliable character, he did report directly to them. And I had to go there in person and track them down and get them to tell me that. And they did confirm that that Ben-Menashe worked directly for them. And they were able to, that in effect, solidified my reporting that there was this secret arms channel of arms sales going from Israel to Iran. And that was a big, big secret. Israel did not want it known. I mean, I think it's one reason I got so much pushback in this, and why so many reporters were discredited. You wonder why Seymour Hersh said you're going to get crushed over this. Well, the bottom line on this is that Israel participated in a covert operation that sabotaged an American presidential election. And we're supposed to be allies. They're not supposed to do that to us. And they did not want that out.
There were other connections, but Craig has mentioned an important one here. De Morange, the head of Des Bureau, or something even more secretive, I don't know.
He was no, it's forgive my French. It's the SDG. See, I'm going to get it screwed. It's essentially the French CIA. He was the top dog in French intelligence, and he helped put together meetings in Paris in late October that were essential for this. And he also helped stage some of the arms deals.
Yeah, let's get to those two meetings. Craig's mentioned them before, but one of the roadblocks that you meet in the 90s. Gosh, Greg, we're referring to the 20th century. We're as old as Methuselah to be able to do that. So
we're getting on.
In the 90s, you saw the roadblock was Casey wasn't in Madrid. Bush wasn't in Paris. What are you going to do about it? And they walk away from you, which was fair enough. So let's start with Madrid. July 28 and 29. Casey was in London for OSS reunion. And there is a chart kept by one of the conveners of the reunion of who attended and who didn't. It's reproduced in Craig's book. You can see it. The chart is not definitive, although Newsweek and then the investigation by the House and Senate both took it as demonstration that Casey was in London the whole time. There was also the suggestion that he was at a club in San Francisco. There was also the suggestion that he couldn't have been there. Somebody testified he was with him. All of these people's memories can be imperfect. We're not looking at sinister here. But what Craig's book does is it lays out how it is that people were assuming information was fixed and it wasn't. So they were always looking for a way to excuse Casey. We know now that Casey was in Madrid and he met with a man named Karoubi. Why?
Well, he meant to set up. He was setting up the October surprise deal, and this is what happened. In terms of his I'm sorry,
Karoubi.
Yeah, he met with Mehdi Karoubi, who was a high-ranking Islamic cleric in July 28th, I believe, in Madrid in 1980. And that's where the original parameters of the October surprise deal were sketched out. And that's where Casey first asked Karoubi when the hostages would be released, and he wanted to make sure it would be after the election, not as soon as possible, but after the election.
That's the Madrid meeting. And once you solve the Madrid meeting, you turn on Casey's network. When we come back, we're going to turn to the Paris meeting because that involves a president of the United States. Very important. The book is Den of Spies, Reagan, Carter, and the Secret History of the Treason That Stole the White House. Craig Unger is the author. Ben-Menashe, the agent for the Israeli military intelligence, Rogue, has produced documents and made many interviews, and part of the information he's convened still remains a whopper. That in October of 1980, weeks before the election, George H.W. Bush, the man who was nominated at the time to be vice president, and we know now has served as president of the United States during the investigation run by the Senate and the House in 91, 92. The allegation is that he traveled to Paris and met with representatives of Iran in order to seal the deal. Craig, the information was always less vital than we have for the meeting in Madrid. De Morange is suspect of having set it up in Paris, but there are alibis, and one of them is meeting with Potter Stewart, a Supreme Court Associate Justice, and his wife. And that Potter Stewart's gone, so there's no source of information there. Please explain what we do have about that so-called meeting. Luncheon, I believe.
Well, I have to give credit to my late colleague Bob Parry, who really punctured this and several other alibis. But he actually interviewed Potter Stewart's widow, and she would not confirm it. And she said, "Oh, you better listen to what the president tells you," which is Bob Perry wasn't exactly the kind of guy who did that, and he went further. And I have to say, in this case, he went further than almost any investigative reporter I know, because once he got the Secret Service reports, some of which appeared to exculpate President Bush, he actually went to the Secret Service agents involved and interviewed them. And he began to realize, no, they really couldn't back up the story. The alibis were not firm. To me, I'm not 100% sure that President Bush was in Paris, but I think his alibis have been punctured.
Detail here. At the time of the alleged meeting in Paris, President Bush is not president. He's not vice president either. He's the former director of the CIA. He's the former head of the Republican Party working for Richard Nixon. He's a disappointed candidate for the Senate from Texas. And he gets Secret Service coverage in those days. Had they initiated the rule that Secret Service would cover all the candidates? Is that what it was?
Yes, they had. He was running for vice president at the time. Yes.
But he
So
wasn't.
he did have Secret Service protection. The question was, did those Secret Service men become so loyal to you that they would lie for you? That was one of the questions.
And it remains unproved. Is that fair to say?
I'm still agnostic. I think the preponderance of evidence suggests that it did happen, that he was in Paris, but I don't think it's as certain. I am certain that Casey was in Madrid and that the October surprise did take place and that the weapons did in fact flow to Iran.
If there was that Paris meeting, since the details had been presented in Madrid in July with Karoubi, what was the purpose of that meeting? What did Iran want from that meeting?
Well, I suspect they wanted someone at the highest level imaginable to put his imprimatur on this deal. That is, they weren't going to get the president to do, Reagan, the presidential candidate, to do it, but George H.W. Bush was the next best thing.
Was the Iraq War started at this point? They were desperate for parts for their aircraft.
The invasion of Iran by Iraq started in late September. So yes, it was. And this was, it's important to understand that Iran's military had been virtually entirely American equipment purchased under the Shah. And in fact, the Shah had actually paid for billions of dollars worth of weapons, which had not yet been delivered. So there were a lot of weapons that were described as frozen assets, and delivering arms to a hostile foreign power that had American hostages seemed horrifying thing politically, completely unacceptable. But letting go of frozen assets didn't seem quite as bad. So that was under consideration by the Carter administration, but they had not acted on it.
Craig Unger is the author. Den of Spies is the title. So far, we've heard from all the players in the Republican Party, all the players in the Carter White House, the go-betweens for Bill Casey, his network reaching back to the OSS. We've heard from major publications, Newsweek and Esquire. We have information gathered together for AP and for publication, investigations by the Joint Committee 91-92 investigating the October surprise story, Gary Sick's book about it, Gary Sick's op-ed page. We've talked all that. What about Iran? It is now the fall of 2014. Craig arrives in Iran. He's got a visa for a week. What was your mission, Craig? What were you looking for?
Well, I figured if the October surprise took place, if there was a deal between the Republicans and Iran, there had to be people in Iran who knew about it. And one of the key people I wanted to interview was a guy named Mohsen Rafighdoost. And he had been an ally of Ayatollah Khomeini from the very start. He had been in Paris when Khomeini was in exile there, and he accompanied Khomeini on the flight back to Tehran, at which point Khomeini was greeted by millions of people in the streets celebrating his return. And Rafik Duke was actually chauffeuring the car as they drove Khomeini through the streets. He later became head of arms. He soon became head of arms procurement for Khomeini, for Khomeini's new revolutionary government. And he was a crucial man. He became enormously wealthy under the Islamic regime. And I wanted to interview him because he had to be knowledgeable about the October surprise.
But waiting for this interview all week, Craig had time to be a tourist in Tehran. And one of the places he visited is the Den of Spies. What's that, Craig?
The Den of Spies is the American embassy, and that's why I titled the book Den of Spies. And it's really become a spy museum. As you enter it, there's I hesitate to call it a welcome mat. I believe it says "Death to America." And when you go in there, they have old-fashioned typewriters, which were presumably in the old American embassy. They have shredding machines that are very dated from that era. Uh, Immediately taking over the embassy, huge numbers of documents had been shredded, and the militants laboriously pasted them back together. And you see all those documents and various exhibits about American espionage and how it uh, undermined Iran.
Emphasis. I know from over the years studying the story that the betrayal of Mosaddegh in 1953 is something that all school children in Iran know about. All the revolutionaries who took over the embassy know about it. They talk about it all the time. And that betrayal of the original efforts by Iran to become a republic burns in them, even in the Iranians that are in the diaspora. I mention all this because part of my family is Persian, Iranian, Assyrian. And in 1952, I believe, maybe three, I didn't have the date fixed, during the Truman administration, so it would have been 51, 52. Mosaddegh traveled to America and was feted in Washington and introduced around, especially to the president, because Mosaddegh was seen as an ally of the United States. And I was 3 or 4 years old, and I was given a bouquet of roses to present to Mosaddegh at the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. And I have photographs of this. Mosaddegh was the great hope of the Iranian people. I was so scared of the roses, I dropped them. They all helped me. But in any event, I tell this because Den of Spies is not inaccurate. The Roosevelt family was involved, along with the British intelligence, in overthrowing Mosaddegh, and he spent the rest of his life under house arrest. It's a tragedy that's never been corrected. Craig, did they talk about Mosaddegh when you were there?
Well, yes, I mean, in fact, President Bani Sadr was very much an acolyte of Mossadegh. And I mean, it's really a very simple story. Mossadegh's big sin in the eyes of the United States, in the eyes of the West, was that he wanted to nationalize the oil industry. And at the time, we still have the BP as an oil outfit. It used to be British Petroleum. But before then, I believe it was the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. But at the time, the deal was the West got 87% of the profits from Iran's oil industry. And Iran wanted to cut a better deal. The Saudis had a much better deal with Aramco. And when that happened, when Mossadegh wanted to nationalized the oil industry. That was the last straw, and the coup went into operation. And as you say, it was led by the Roosevelt family. Kermit Roosevelt and his brother, or was it his cousin Archibald Roosevelt, were among the big plotters who put the coup d'état that overthrew Mosaddegh, and they put that coup into place.
Craig is in Iran during the time of the presidency of Rouhani, who recently died in a helicopter crash. At that point, Obama administration, there was a warmth and a softening of the relationship between Washington and Tehran that was not absolute war. This is reaching back one presidency, two presidencies, because what we're looking at here is why it's possible for Craig to finally meet with people who are not in total denial of the October surprise. One of them is Davoud Bavan, a spokesman for Iran who dresses very well at the time. Craig makes a point of saying he's dressed in a tie, which is verboten most of the time in Iran because it's too much like our oppressors. But at the time, he felt free to do it. And then finally, this final day, your minder, your translator, takes you to meet Mohsen Rafighdoost. And your presentation to him is important. And also your iPhone is important. Tell the story, Craig.
Right. Well, I had wanted to meet with Mosaddegh forever. I mean, I thought about it years in advance, and I kind of had to do it on the sly. And
Rafighdoost, you were meeting with.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah, Rafik. And when you travel, and obviously I don't speak Farsi, so and even if I did, any American at that time had to be accompanied by a fixer who would serve as a translator and take you around to whatever appointments you wanted to see. And from the beginning, I told my fixer that I wanted to meet with Rafik, and it took a while. He kept trying, and getting through the bureaucracy and the traffic and all that in Iran is very, very difficult. But finally, the day before I was scheduled to leave, the day before my visa was set to expire, he called me up at 8 in the morning, said, get dressed and I'll pick you up in 5 minutes. And he took me to the office of Rafighdoost, and I had half an hour with him. And doing interviews with someone through a translator is very difficult, especially in this case, because I believe Rafighdoost did speak English well enough to understand the questions I was asking, and I obviously did not speak any Farsi whatsoever. So he had a big advantage over me. It's very hard to sort of catch someone in a lie when you're doing that kind of interview. But I did get to ask all the questions, and at one point, Rafighdoost said, this is according to my translator, but he said, oh, yes, when we met with the Republicans. And then he stepped back and corrected himself and said, if we met with the Republicans. And it wasn't clear to me if he had sort of unwittingly conceded that the October surprise had taken place. In the end, he kind of denied it. But while I was there, this was 2014, and I think this was the first generation of iPhones where you could easily videotape a meeting. And my phone happened to be set up in a very where I framed him quite well, and I merely pushed the button and I videotaped it. So I do have a videotape of that recording.
When we met with the Republicans. All right. So the suggestion here, this is just like a spy thriller that you've made up, Craig, except you've lived it. The suggestion here is that a lot of people in Iran still know about this. There are
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. And when I met with Bavand, he seemed to be quite comfortable with the idea that it happened, but he said he did not have firsthand knowledge. He seemed not to be too scared of talking to me. But in general, everyone knew that this was taboo. this is something you don't want to talk about. And it's partly because it meant that Iran had secret relationship with Israel, and that was completely taboo. It was verboten. No one would dare admit that had taken place.
There's a photograph in Craig's book, February 1980, with the Ayatollah and Bani Sadr in Iran together. There's a photograph in Craig's book of Craig with Bani Sadr in Versailles in 2016. What did you learn from him, Craig, about this? Is he shy also of acknowledging, or does he go right in and explain what happened?
And Bani Sadr went right into it, and he delivered a lot of documents to the House of Representatives when they were investigating the October surprise. Unfortunately, they did not do due diligence, and they sort of abandoned. So those were some of the documents they left in the ladies' room under the tampon dispenser, and Bob Parry discovered them much later. Bani Sadr gave me the same set of documents, and he was quite open about it. In fact, he explained what had happened, that this was an act, the October surprise was not just an action directed against Jimmy Carter that was a coup d'etat, like a coup d'etat in part, but it was a double coup d'etat because in Iran the same thing was going on, and he was ousted as president of Iran and was impeached later. He survived 3 assassination attempts, and he eventually fled Iran and was living in exile in France when I met him.
The book is Den of Spies. The author, Craig Unger, Reagan, Carter, and the Secret History of the Treason That Stole the White House. These many decades later, this is American presidential history, and therefore caution is well advised. However, we have a mystery to solve, and perhaps it's solved in front of me, but I have the author here to ask. On January 20th, 1981, Ronald Reagan is sworn in as President of the United States, Inauguration Day. And as he begins his inaugural speech, the hostages, I believe, are still in custody, incarcerated, trapped in Tehran. And as he ends his speech, the announcement comes that they've been freed. Is that accurate, Craig? Did it happen that way?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, Jimmy Carter, they had agreed to release them while Jimmy Carter was president. And this was the last day of Jimmy Carter's presidency. He got 0 sleep. He may have napped on a couch in the Oval Office. He was making sure again and again that every I had been dotted, every T had been crossed, and he kept waiting anxiously for them to release them during his administration. And there, Ronald Reagan was up on the podium taking the oath of office, and it was about 3 minutes later that the hostages were actually in planes, they were on the tarmac, but they did not take off until Reagan took the oath of office. And it was one of those things where it seems obvious on the face of it that the Reagan campaign had to have made a secret deal. Before he became president, he had no authority whatsoever to negotiate with Iran. And his presidency was roughly 3 minutes old, and we all saw him on the podium. So when could he possibly have met with Iran? That was not possible. The Onion, the satirical magazine, had a wonderful joke about it when they looked back they did a book on the 20th century looking back on this day. They said, they had the headline, Ronald Reagan inaugurated, urges America not to put 2 and 2 together. And so something had to have happened. That was the great mystery, but no one seemed to notice.
These many decades later, I report to Craig that recently I've had a happy conversation with the biographer Max Boot, who writes a column for the Washington Post, but he's written a massively, carefully researched biography of Ronald Reagan. And it's happy to have that because Reagan lived many lives before he arrived at the White House. But in there, when we come to the story of the campaign of 1980, Max Boot, as a biographer, acknowledges the October surprise, acknowledges that the information gathered today is sufficient to say that it happened. Now, I've not been looking around for other reactions to your publication, but there is that old understanding in Britain that publication brings information. Is that true so far, Craig?
Yes, it is. I mean, I got a wonderful call from Portugal just yesterday with some new information on this, and it's everything confirms what anything I've gotten confirms what I've reported, and I think what's amazing is that since publication, no one has challenged, to my knowledge, challenged a single fact that I've reported.
And details. There are diaries, some pages missing. There are diaries we don't know about. There's the Bush Library. There's the Reagan Library. There's the Clinton Library. There's the George W. Bush Library. All of these libraries, everywhere, has not been searched thoroughly yet. Is that true, Craig? I mean, I'm wondering that story you tell of Bob Parry discovering in a former lady's bathroom documents that were sitting right in plain view of the Congress's investigation. So is it your assumption that there's information out there that we have, but we haven't yet correctly understood?
Absolutely. I mean, I have to say that, when I got Bob Parry's archives, it's 23 gigabytes. A gigabyte of print has something like 678,000 pages of information. So this is an enormous amount of data. It's more than any one single person can read. And I'm sure there's other information stashed away in various other presidential libraries.
Finally, the author, we have a minute. Why is this important for young people to understand? How does this help us here in the 21st century?
To me, it's a context in terms of where we are today. And I've done 6 books on the Republican Party's assault on democracy. This was one of them. It's the earliest one that I've investigated, but there were others. There was one in 1968 with Anna Chennault, and this was Richard Nixon running against Hubert Humphrey, and the Vietnam peace talks suddenly ended just before the election. Well, the reason happens to be was that Nixon, who was not in office at the time, got a woman named Anna Chennault to tell Vietnam to back out of the peace talks.
30 seconds.
So we've seen that kind of thing again and again. It was covert back in those days, but today we have Donald Trump and his ties to Russia. And I think there's a consistent theme here where the Republicans have often relied on third-party relations with adversarial, hostile countries who've intervened in American elections.
Craig Unger, the book is Den of Spies, which is the name of the old American embassy in Tehran. And I envy him having visited. Reagan, Carter, and the secret history of the treason that stole the White House. I'm John Batchelor.